The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cavernous assembly building at Willow Run, Michigan, on a grey afternoon in March of 1945. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann stood with 19 other German prisoners of war, their worn Afrika Korps uniforms replaced by the standard blue denim work clothes issued to POWs in American labor programs. They had been told they were being taken to observe American industrial methods as part of a special orientation program. What they were not told was that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of why Germany had lost the war. The guide, a middle-aged Ford Motor Company production supervisor named Robert Mitchell, gestured toward the assembly line stretching into the distance. "Gentlemen," he said in accented but serviceable German, "what you are about to see is the B-24 Liberator production line. We complete one aircraft every 63 minutes. Hartmann heard the provected translation but did not believe it. He had spent 3 years maintaining Luftwaffe aircraft in North Africa before his capture outside Tunis in May of 1943. He knew how aircraft were built. Teams of skilled craftsmen worked for weeks on a single airframe, hand-fitting components, adjusting tolerances, solving problems as they arose. The idea that a 4-engine heavy bomber could roll off an assembly line faster than it took to cook a proper meal was absurd. It had to be propaganda, another example of American exaggeration. Then the line began to move, and Hartmann's certainty began to crack. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The collision between German prisoners of war and American industrial capacity during the Second World War created one of history's most profound psychological ruptures. These men, trained to believe in German technological players and cultural superiority, found themselves confronted with material evidence so overwhelming that it shattered the ideological framework that had sustained them through years of combat. The Ford Willow Run facility, specifically designed to mass-produce B-24 Liberator bombers using automotive assembly line techniques, became the physical manifestation of the industrial disparity that had doomed the Axis powers from the moment the United States entered the war. To understand the psychological impact of what these prisoners witnessed, we must first understand what they had been taught to believe about America and about themselves. German military indoctrination in the years leading up to and during the Second World War emphasized several interconnected themes. First, German engineering represented the pinnacle of technical achievement, a product of centuries of scientific and industrial tradition. Second, that American society was fundamentally weak and decadent, corrupted by materialism, racial mixing, and democratic chaos. Third, that American industry, while capable of producing consumer goods in quantity, lacked the precision and sophistication necessary for advanced military equipment. These were not fringe beliefs confined to Nazi party zealots. They permeated German military culture at every level, reinforced through training, propaganda films, and the everyday discourse of military life. The Luftwaffe, in particular, cultivated a sense of technical superiority. German aircraft designers had pioneered many innovations in the 1930s: all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, variable pitch propellers, sophisticated engine supercharging. The Messerschmitt, Bf-109, and Focke-Wulf W-190 fighters were genuinely excellent aircraft, incorporating cutting-edge engineering. Luftwaffe mechanics like Hartmann took pride in maintaining these complex machines, viewing their work as a skilled craft requiring years of training and experience. This pride was built on real accomplishments. German aircraft manufacturing in the late 1930s and early war years did represent a high level of technical sophistication, but it was sophisticated in a particular way, emphasizing performance and engineering elegance over ease of production. A German aircraft was often a masterpiece of individual craftsmanship, with components hand-fitted by skilled workers who had undergone lengthy apprenticeships. This approach yielded exceptional individual aircraft, but it could not scale efficiently to the demands of total war. American industry had evolved along a fundamentally different path. The United States had been the birthplace of mass production, pioneered by men like Henry Ford, and applied with revolutionary effect to automobile manufacturing in the early 20th century. Ford's Highland Park plant, which began operation in 1913, introduced the moving assembly line that would transform industrial production worldwide. By breaking complex products into standardized components and organizing workers into specialized teams performing repetitive tasks, American manufacturers achieved production volumes that would have been inconceivable under traditional craft methods. When the United States entered the Second World War in December of 1941, this mass production expertise was turned toward military equipment. The challenge was formidable. Aircraft were vastly more complex than automobiles, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch and systems that had to function reliably at altitudes where the temperature dropped to 60 degrees below zero and the air pressure was a fraction of sea level. Traditional aircraft manufacturing treated each plane as a unique creation, with skilled workers adjusting and fitting components to account for inevitable variations. The solution that Ford Motor Company and other American manufacturers implemented was to apply automotive, mass production principles with unprecedented rigor. Instead of accepting variation and compensating through skilled hand-fitting, they invested in precision tooling that could produce identical components by the thousands. Instead of relying on experienced craftsmen to assemble aircraft, they designed assembly processes that could be performed by workers with minimal training, many of them women who had never worked in manufacturing before. The B-24 Liberator, designed by Consolidated Aircraft and selected for mass production by Ford, became the test case for this approach. In December of 1940, Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, visited Consolidated's San Diego facility to evaluate the aircraft. What he saw was traditional aircraft manufacturing, skilled workers building planes essentially by hand, one at a time. Sorensen, a man who had helped design the Model T assembly line, immediately recognized that this method would never produce aircraft in the quantities the war would demand. That night, in his hotel room, Sorensen sketched a vision of something unprecedented, an aircraft assembly line operating on automotive principles. The facility would be enormous, the largest single industrial building ever constructed. It would use precision tooling to produce standardized components. It would employ tens of thousands of workers, most with no previous aircraft experience, and it would produce completed four-engine bombers at a rate measured in hours, not weeks. Construction of the Willow Run plant began in April of 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor. The main building covered 3.5 million square feet, 67 acres, under a single roof. The assembly line stretched more than a mile, with a distinctive 90-degree turn, 2/3 of the way through that was necessary to keep the facility within a single county for tax purposes. When completed, it was the largest room in the world. The early months were troubled. The Army Air Forces kept changing B-24 specifications, requiring expensive modifications to Ford's carefully planned production line. Consolidated Aircraft proved difficult to work with. Ford engineers discovered that many technical drawings were incomplete or contradictory. Skilled workers were scarce, and housing near the plant was inadequate. The press, initially celebratory, turned skeptical. "Will it run?" the Detroit Free Press asked mockingly in May of 1942. In all of 1942, Willow Run produced just 56 bombers. German intelligence officers who tracked Allied production dismissed the facility as another example of American industrial overreach, ambitious but ultimately impractical. The reports that reached Berlin confirmed what German planners wanted to believe, that American mass production methods were unsuited to complex military equipment, that quality would always triumph over quantity, that German technological and organizational superiority would prevail. But beneath the visible struggles, something profound was happening. Ford engineers were solving problems that had seemed insurmountable. They were learning to translate traditional aircraft manufacturing into mass production processes. They were training workers, including thousands of women who had never held industrial jobs, to perform specialized tasks with speed and precision. They were creating a system that could produce not just individual excellent aircraft, but excellent aircraft in overwhelming numbers. By January of 1943, production began to accelerate. The plant produced 37 bombers that month, in February 75, in March, 104. The numbers continued climbing through the spring and summer. By August of 1943, Willow Run was producing 190 bombers per month. By March of 1944, production reached 432 aircraft. The plant was completing a B-24 every 63 minutes. The B-24 itself was a formidable weapon. It weighed 36,000 pounds empty and could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs over 2,000 miles. It was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R1800 radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. The aircraft required 450,000 individual parts, including 360,000 rivets. Every component had to meet exacting specifications and fit precisely with every other component, and Willow Run was producing them faster than 1 per hour. This achievement represented more than engineering skill. It represented a complete reimagining of how complex machines could be manufactured. German aircraft plants employed highly skilled craftsmen who required years of training. Willow Run employed workers who might have been secretaries or housewives 6 months earlier, performing repetitive tasks that required precision but not years of apprenticeship. German plants produced aircraft one at a time, with each requiring individual attention. Willow Run produced aircraft on a moving assembly line where the choreography of production was planned to the minute. The difference was not just philosophical, it was mathematical. By the end of 1944, American factories had produced 96,000 military aircraft, more than Germany produced during the entire war. The B-24 alone accounted for 18,482 aircraft produced between 1940 and 1945, more than any other American military aircraft in history. Willow Run's contribution was 8,685 of these, roughly half the total B-24 production. German prisoners of war in the United States were largely shielded from this reality. They lived behind barbed wire in camps scattered across the American interior. Their contact with American poverty, society carefully managed. They worked on farms and in factories, earning minimal wages, living in conditions that were adequate but hardly luxurious. Many clung to the beliefs that had sustained them through combat that Germany would develop wonder weapons, that the tide would turn, that their sacrifice had meaning. But some prisoners were selected for special programs. The United States War Department recognized that German POWs would eventually return home, and that their attitudes would influence post-war Germany. A program was developed to expose selected prisoners to democratic principles and American industrial capacity. The goal was not propaganda in the crude sense, not to break their spirit or humiliate them, but to provide evidence that might challenge the ideological certainty that had made Nazism possible. Industrial facility tours were part of this program. Small groups of prisoners, usually those identified as less ideologically committed to Nazism, were taken to American factories. The purposes were multiple: to demonstrate American productive capacity, to show that mass production did not mean inferior quality, and to reveal the material superiority that had made Allied victory inevitable. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann was selected for such a tour in March of 1945. He had been a prisoner for nearly 2 years, long enough to recover from the physical and psychological trauma of capture, but not long enough to fully process what he had witnessed of American plenty. He had worked on farms in Kansas, lived in heated barracks, eaten 3 meals a day, and bought chocolate from the camp canteen. He had seen American trucks and jeeps in numbers that seemed impossible. He had read American newspapers that casually discussed production figures that exceeded Germany's entire industrial output. But newspapers could be dismissed as propaganda. Trucks could be explained as concentration of resources for show. Even the abundant food could be rationalized. Perhaps the Americans were simply wasting resources on prisoners that should have been used for combat. Hartmann, like many prisoners, retained a core belief that German engineering and organization remained superior, that the material abundance he witnessed was somehow hollow, that it masked a fundamental weakness in American society and industry. The tour of Willow Run was designed to shatter that last illusion. The prisoners were transported by bus from their camp to the facility, a journey of several hours. They passed through the Michigan countryside, seeing farms and small towns that showed no evidence of wartime privation. The guards were relaxed, almost casual. One offered cigarettes. Another made awkward small talk about the weather. The prisoners sat in silence, watching America roll past the windows. Willow Run itself was visible from miles away, an enormous structure dominating the flat Michigan landscape. As the bus approached, the prisoners could see the top's distinctive L shape of the main building, the parking lots filled with thousands of cars belonging to workers on the day shift, the rail sidings, where components arrived from suppliers across the country. The scale was overwhelming even before they entered the building. They were processed through a security checkpoint, given visitor badges, and assembled in a waiting area. Robert Mitchell, their guide, introduced himself and explained the day's itinerary in competent German. He had worked for Ford's German subsidiary before the war and understood both the language and the culture. He knew that his audience had been trained to believe in German superiority. His job was not to argue with them, but to show them something that would speak for itself. The tour began in the main assembly building. Mitchell led the group through double doors into the production area, and Hartman felt his breath catch. The space was vast beyond comprehension, a third of a mile long, a quarter mile wide, with ceilings high enough to accommodate completed aircraft. The lighting was bright and even. Banks of fluorescent tubes eliminated shadows. The noise was tremendous, a constant roar of machinery, pneumatic tools, and moving equipment. And stretching into the distance, disappearing toward a vanishing point so far away it seemed like a perspective drawing, was the assembly line. Mitchell let them stand and stare for a full minute before speaking. When he did, his voice was matter-of-fact, almost casual. "Gentlemen, you are looking at the world's largest room under a single roof. The main assembly line you see before you is 5,600 feet long, just over 1 mile. At its peak operation, which is approximately where we are now, this facility completes one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. One of the prisoners, a former Luftwaffe officer named Werner Koch, spoke up. "You mean," he said carefully in German, "that you complete 1 aircraft per day working, 3 shifts?" Mitchell smiled. "No, I mean we complete 1 aircraft every 63 minutes. That's approximately 23 aircraft per day, operating around the clock." The prisoners looked at each other. Several appeared confused. Koch's expression suggested he thought there had been a translation error. Hartman felt a strange sensation in his chest, as if the air had become denser. "Perhaps," Mitchell continued, "it would be helpful to see the process. We'll walk along the line from the beginning to the end. What you'll observe is a B-24 being assembled from major subcomponents that have been manufactured elsewhere in the facility or delivered from suppliers. The final assembly takes approximately 1 hour as each airframe moves through the stations. They began walking. The assembly line moved at a steady pace, slow enough that workers could keep up on foot, but fast enough that the progress was visible. Mitchell explained that the line had been designed to move at precisely 100 feet per hour, synchronized with the time required for each workstation's tasks. The first station they encountered was the fuselage assembly area. Here, major fuselage sections, nose, center, and tail arrived on overhead conveyors from sub-assembly areas elsewhere in the plant. Hartman watched as workers guided a center fuselage section into position, aligned it with precision jigs, and began the process of joining it to forward and aft sections. The work was fast, practiced, coordinated. There was no hesitation, no discussion of how to proceed. The workers knew exactly what to do because they performed the same tasks every 63 minutes. Mitchell gestured toward the workers. Most of the people you see here had never worked in manufacturing before the war. Many are women. All received training of between 4 and 6 weeks before beginning work on the line. The key is that we've broken the assembly process into tasks simple enough that they can be performed correctly with relatively brief training, but precise enough that the final product meets military specifications. They moved on. At each station, components appeared and were installed with practiced efficiency. Wings arrived on elaborate cradles, already complete with engines, fuel tanks, landing gear, and control surfaces installed at subassembly stations elsewhere in the facility. Hartman watched as a wing was mated to a fuselage, the alignment achieved through precision jigs that ensured every B-24 wing attached at exactly the same angle with exactly the same bolt pattern. No hand fitting, no adjustment, just precision manufacturing and standardization taken to a degree he had never imagined possible. The tail section arrived similarly complete. The tail gunner's turret was installed as a unit. The bomb bay doors were hung on pre-aligned hinges. The cockpit instruments, pre-assembled and pre-tested on special benches, were installed as complete panels. Everything was designed for speed without sacrificing precision. Mitchell maintained his narration, explaining each step. The key innovation was to treat aircraft manufacturing like automobile manufacturing. Henry Ford proved that complex machines could be built on assembly lines if you standardized components and broke assembly into simple, repeatable tasks. We've applied those same principles here, but at a much larger scale and with much tighter tolerances. They walked for nearly an hour, following the assembly line from empty fuselage sections to nearly complete aircraft. Hartman counted his paces and calculated distances. The line was indeed more than a mile long. They passed hundreds of workers, each performing specialized tasks. Not one appeared to be struggling or improvising. The choreography was perfect. As they approached the end of the line, Mitchell checked his watch. "Gentlemen, if my timing is correct, we should witness a completion in approximately 5 minutes." They gathered near the final station, where workers were performing final inspections and preparing to move a completed aircraft off the line. The bomber sat on wheeled dollies, engines cowled, propellers installed, every panel and door in place. It looked ready to fly. Hartman stared at the aircraft, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. This B-24, this 4-engine heavy bomber, with its 10-ton maximum takeoff weight and its ability to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs to targets over 1,000 miles away, had been assembled in approximately 1 hour. In Germany, a comparable aircraft, if Germany even possessed one, which it did not, would take weeks to manufacture. A whistle blew. Workers stepped back. A tractor operator climbed into the seat of a small tug vehicle, hooked it to the nose gear of the completed bomber, and began towing it off the line. The aircraft rolled toward the exit, making way for the next airframe that was already moving into position. The entire transition took less than 3 minutes. Mitchell gestured toward the departing aircraft. That B-24 will now go to the flight test area, where test pilots will spend approximately 30 minutes checking all systems. Assuming it passes and 98% do on the first inspection, it will be accepted by Army Air Forces inspectors and added to the delivery queue. Most likely it will be on a transport ship to Europe or the Pacific within 2 weeks. Another aircraft rolled off the line as he spoke. The prisoners watched in silence. Mitchell consulted his watch again. 61 minutes since the last completion. We're running slightly ahead of schedule today. Werner Koch, the former Luftwaffe officer, spoke again. His voice was quiet, and he seemed to be talking more to himself than to Mitchell. "This is not possible. Aircraft are not built this way. They cannot be built this way." Mitchell responded gently. "And yet, you are watching it happen." Ford Willow Run will produce approximately 2,500 B-24s this year. That's in addition to production from Consolidated's factories in San Diego and Fort Worth, from Douglas in Tulsa, and from North American in Dallas. Combined American production of 4-engine heavy bombers, B-17, B-24, and B-29 will exceed 40,000 aircraft before the war ends. The numbers were too large to process. Hartman did the arithmetic instinctively. 40,000 heavy bombers, each capable of carrying 4 to 10 tons of ordnance, each requiring 4 engines, each engine representing thousands of hours of skilled labor. Except that was wrong. The engines were not produced by skilled labor, not in the sense Hartman understood the term. They were produced on assembly lines, just like the aircraft themselves. Germany's entire wartime aircraft production, all types combined, was approximately 113,000 aircraft. American production would exceed 300,000, and American aircraft were, on average, much larger and more complex than their German equivalents. A B-24 represented perhaps 10 times the manufacturing effort of a Bf-109. The disparity in actual productive capacity was not 3-1, it was more like 30-1. Mitchell led them to an observation deck overlooking the final assembly area. From this elevated position, they could see the entire line stretched out before them. At any given moment, approximately 100 aircraft were in various stages of completion. Every 63 minutes, one rolled off the end. The mathematics were inescapable. "Gentlemen," Mitchell said, "I want to emphasize something important. What you see here is not unique to Willow Run. This facility is the largest and most productive, yes. But similar methods are being applied in aircraft plants across America, Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in California, Consolidated in Texas, North American in WT, Kansas. Each has adapted automotive mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing. The principles are the same everywhere: standardization, specialization, and volume." He paused, letting them absorb the scene. "I'm showing you this not to humiliate you, but because you'll be going home eventually. When you return to Germany, you'll help rebuild your country. Understanding how America won this war, understanding that it was won in factories like this one before it was won on battlefields, that understanding might help ensure we don't have to do this again in another 25 years." The prisoners stood in silence. Hartmann found himself thinking about his service in North Africa. He remembered the constant struggles with supply, the shortages of spare parts, the improvisation that had been necessary to keep aircraft flying. He remembered how every aircraft lost was an irreplaceable blow, how crews flew worn-out machines because replacements were not available. He remembered believing that German technical superiority would compensate for material disadvantages. He had been wrong. German technical superiority, real as it was in certain specific ways, could not compete with this level of productive capacity. You could not handcraft your way to victory when your enemy was producing weapons by the thousand using automated processes. Quality did not defeat quantity when the quantity was this overwhelming, and the quality was also maintained through precision manufacturing. One of the other prisoners, a young corporal named Friedrich Braun, asked a question in halting German. How many people work here?" Mitchell consulted a paper he pulled from his pocket. "Current employment at Willow Run is approximately 42,000 workers. At peak, we employed just over 43,000. Of these, roughly 40% are women. Most had no manufacturing experience before the war. 42,000 workers, producing 23 bombers per day." Hartmann did the math again. That was approximately 1,800 person-hours of labor per aircraft, from raw materials to completed bomber. It seemed impossible, but he had watched it happen with his own eyes. The tour continued for another hour. Mitchell showed them the sub-assembly areas where components were manufactured. They saw the wing assembly section, where wings were built on jigs that ensured everyone was identical to a tolerance of 1/1000th of an inch. They saw the engine installation area, where Pratt & Whitney R1800 engines arrived from outside suppliers and were mounted to wings in a process that took skilled workers in Germany days, but was accomplished here in under an hour. They visited the tool and die shop, where precision machinery was manufactured and maintained. The shop contained machine tools more advanced than anything Hartmann had seen in Germany, equipment that could mill complex shapes to tolerances, measured in millionths of an inch. Mitchell explained that Ford had developed many of these tools specifically for Willow Run, innovations in precision manufacturing that would have applications far beyond the war. Throughout the tour, Hartmann noticed something that disturbed him more than the sheer scale of production. The workers, he observed, seemed neither particularly skilled nor particularly driven. They performed their tasks with competence but not passion. They chatted with each other during breaks. They seemed to regard their work as simply a job, not as a crusade or a test of national will. And yet they produced 23 bombers per day. German propaganda had insisted that only a society unified by ideology and driven by collective purpose could achieve great industrial feats. Here was evidence that the opposite was true. These workers, many of them women who had been housewives 2 years earlier, were producing weapons at a rate that dwarfed anything Germany had achieved. They did so not because they were inspired by a great leader or motivated by racial ideology, but because they worked within a system that multiplied individual effort through organization and technology. The tour concluded in a conference room where Mitchell provided additional context. He distributed folders containing unclassified production statistics. The numbers confirmed what the prisoners had witnessed: Willow Run's output, total American aircraft production, steel production, vehicle production. The figures were staggering, and they were documented in official government reports that the prisoners could verify when they returned home. "Before we conclude," Mitchell said, "I want to address something that I imagine you're thinking. You may wonder if what you've seen today is somehow staged, if we've manufactured a show to deceive you. I assure you it is not. Everything you've witnessed is normal, daily production. If you doubt this, consider that the B-24s, rolling off this line, are flying combat missions over your homeland. The evidence of what we produce here is dropping bombs on Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. The scale you've witnessed is the scale at which America wages war." He let that sink in, then continued. "You were sent to war by leaders who told you that Germany would win through superior technology and superior will. What you've learned today is that wars between industrial nations are won by industrial capacity. Germany attempted to compete with America using methods that belonged to the 19th century skilled craftsmen building weapons one at a time. America applied 20th century mass production. The outcome was never in doubt once we fully mobilized. The prisoners filed out of the conference room in silence. They boarded the bus for the return trip to their camp. No one spoke during the first hour of the journey. Hartman sat staring out the window, watching rural Michigan pass by, trying to process what he had witnessed. Finally, Werner Koch, the former Luftwaffe officer, said what they were all thinking. "We never had a chance. From the moment they entered the war, we were finished. We just didn't know it yet." No one disagreed. The return journey from Willow Run took place in near silence, but the silence was not empty. It was the silence of men whose foundational beliefs were collapsing under the weight of evidence they could not dismiss. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann sat near the back of the bus, staring at the folder Mitchell had given him, though he was no longer reading the statistics. The numbers had become meaningless, or rather, they had acquired a meaning so profound that individual figures no longer mattered. What mattered was the pattern they revealed, the inescapable mathematical reality that Germany had attempted to fight a war it could never win. The folder contained production data that would have been classified military intelligence in Germany, but was distributed freely to prisoners in America. Total American aircraft production by year: approximately 6,000 in 1940, 19,000 in 1941, 47,000 in 1942, 86,000 in 1943, 96,000 in 1944. The progression told a story of industrial mobilization on a scale that had no historical precedent. By comparison, German aircraft production peaked at approximately 40,000 in 1944, less than half American output, achieved only through desperate measures, including the use of slave labor and the dispersal of factories to caves and forests to escape Allied bombing. But even these figures understated the disparity. American aircraft were, on average, much larger and more complex than German equivalents. A B-24 required approximately 50 times the manufacturing effort of a Bf-109 fighter. When measured not in number of aircraft but in total productive output, total weight of airframes, total number of engines, total bomb-carrying capacity, the American advantage exceeded 10 to 1. And this was just an aircraft. Similar disparities existed in every category of military equipment. The bus passed through the outskirts of Detroit, and Hartman found himself staring at the industrial landscape with new understanding. What he had previously dismissed as mere quantity now revealed itself as something more profound. These factories, these assembly lines, this entire industrial infrastructure represented a different way of organizing human effort. Germany had attempted to compete through superior craftsmanship and technological innovation. America had built systems that made craftsmanship unnecessary and that could incorporate innovation rapidly into mass production. At the prisoner of war camp that evening, Hartmann found himself unable to eat dinner, though the meal was the standard adequate rations that American camps provided. Other prisoners from the Willow Run tour sat scattered throughout the mess hall, each processing what they had witnessed in their own way. Some seemed angry, as if they had been deceived. Others appeared simply exhausted, as if a great burden had been lifted by the recognition that defeat had been inevitable. A few maintained defiant expressions, insisting loudly that what they had seen was somehow falsified, that the true German secret weapons would still turn the tide. Werner Koch approached Hartmann's table and sat down without asking permission. The former Luftwaffe officer had been quiet during the return journey, but his face now showed signs of having reached some internal conclusion. He spoke quietly, conscious that their conversation might be overheard by guards or by the hardcore Nazi loyalists who enforced ideological discipline among prisoners. "I flew Stukas in France and Russia," Koch said without preamble. "I believed we had the best aircraft, the best training, the best tactics. I watched Russian factories evacuate to the Urals and assume that they destroyed their productive capacity. I watched the Luftwaffe achieve air superiority in 1940 and 1941 and assumed it would last. I was told American aircraft were inferior, that their pilots were poorly trained, that their industrial methods produced quantity without quality." He paused, staring at his untouched food. "Today I watched them complete a 4-engine bomber in 1 hour. 1 hour. Do you understand what that means? It means that while I was flying my Stuka on 6 or 7 missions over a 3-week period in Russia, desperately trying to slow Soviet advances, American factories were producing enough heavy bombers to flatten every city in Germany. It means that every aircraft we shot down was replaced faster than we could shoot them down. It means we were fighting arithmetic, and arithmetic does not care about courage or skill or ideology." Hartmann nodded slowly. "I maintained aircraft in North Africa. We cannibalized wrecks for spare parts. We flew machines that should have been scrapped. We improvised repairs because proper replacement components were not available. I thought this was temporary, that it reflected the difficulties of supply across the Mediterranean. I did not understand that it reflected Germany's fundamental inability to sustain industrial warfare against an enemy with America's productive capacity. The question," Koch continued, "is what we do with this knowledge. We will eventually return to Germany. We will find a destroyed country, occupied by the armies whose industrial might we have now witnessed firsthand. Do we tell the truth about why we lost? Do we explain that we were sent to die in a war that was unwinnable from the start? Or do we maintain the comfortable lies about betrayal and wonder about weapons that failed to arrive in time?" Before Hartmann could respond, a voice interrupted from the next table. "You speak like defeatists." The speaker was Hauptmann Dieter Schmidt, an SS officer who had commanded a panzer battalion before capture. Schmidt represented the faction of prisoners who refused to accept defeat, who interpreted every piece of evidence as Allied propaganda, who maintained absolute loyalty to the Reich, even from behind barbed wire in Kansas. The Americans stage an elaborate show, and you accept it as truth. Have you learned nothing? This is psychological warfare, designed to break our spirits. Koch turned to face Schmidt directly. "I watched a 4-engine bomber roll off an assembly line every 63 minutes. I calculated the production rates. I saw the employment figures. I observed the workers, ordinary people, many of them women, performing tasks that required skill but not years of training. This was not a show. This was normal production, and it explains why cities across Germany are burning, why the Luftwaffe barely exists, why we are here as prisoners rather than defending the Reich." Schmidt's face reddened. "You are a traitor, too." "I am a realist," Koch interrupted. "The war is over. We lost. The only question is whether we learn why, or whether we continue believing the lies that led us into catastrophe in the first place. The confrontation might have escalated, but an American guard approached and gestured for silence. The mess hall quieted. Such moments of tension were common in POW camps, where different factions of prisoners maintained incompatible worldviews and sometimes enforced their beliefs through violence. The American authorities generally allowed prisoners to self-govern within the barracks, but intervened to prevent serious conflicts. After dinner, Hartman returned to his barracks and found several other prisoners from the Willow Run tour gathered near his bunk. They wanted to discuss what they had witnessed, to process the implications in the relative privacy of their sleeping quarters, away from the hardliners like Schmidt. Friedrich Braun, the young corporal who had asked about employment figures, seemed particularly shaken. "I joined the Hitler Youth when I was 10, Braun said. "I was taught that Germany represented the pinnacle of civilization, that we were destined to lead Europe into a new golden age, that our enemies were racially and culturally inferior. I believed this with absolute certainty. When I was conscripted in 1943, I was proud to serve. Even after capture, even after seeing American abundance, I believed we would win because we were superior." He gestured helplessly toward the window, beyond which the American camp stretched in neat, orderly rows. "Today I watched people I was taught to despise mongrels. We called them a mixed-race democracy that our teachers said could never achieve greatness. I watched them produce weapons at a rate that makes German industry look like a medieval craft guild. How do I reconcile what I was taught with what I have seen?" One of the older prisoners, a veteran of the First World War named Otto Kraus, spoke up. "You reconcile it by accepting that you were lied to, not just about American industry, about everything, about German superiority, about the war's purpose, about what our leaders were trying to achieve, and what they were willing to sacrifice to achieve it." Kraus had fought on the Western Front in 1918 and had been skeptical of National Socialism from its doublelives, beginning, though he had kept his skepticism private after the party consolidated power. His capture in North Africa had been almost a relief, an escape from a cause he had long since stopped believing in. He spoke with the authority of age and experience, and the younger prisoners listened. "I watched Germany lose one war because our leadership overestimated our strength and underestimated our enemies," Kraus continued. "Then I watched us do it again, making the same mistakes on an even larger scale. Today you saw the result. American factories producing bombers like we produced rifle bullets. This is what happens when ideology replaces reality, when leaders surround themselves with yes-men who tell them what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. But what do we do?" Braun asked. "When we return home, assuming we survive that long, what do we tell people? That we fought for nothing? That our comrades died for lies?" "We tell the truth," Koch said firmly. "We explain that Germany started a war it could not win, and that millions died because our leaders either did not understand or did not care about the industrial realities of modern warfare. We explain that the Americans did not win through treachery or through racial superiority or through any of the explanations that Nazi ideology provides. They won because they had better systems, industrial systems, economic systems, political systems that could mobilize resources more efficiently than authoritarian control." Hartman listened to this exchange, recognizing that he was witnessing a transformation that was occurring throughout the prisoner of war camps. The Americans called it re-education, though that term suggested a more formal process than what actually happened. The re-education was simply exposure to American newspapers that reported facts without censorship, to American abundance that contradicted propaganda about enemy weakness, to experiences like the Willow Run tour that provided evidence too overwhelming to dismiss. Not all prisoners were affected. Men like Hauptmann Schmidt remained convinced of Nazi ideology and would carry that conviction home with them. But many others, perhaps most, underwent some version of the shift Hartman was experiencing, a recognition that everything they had been taught was fundamentally wrong, that the war had been lost before it began, that their sacrifice had served a monstrous regime pursuing impossible goals. The Special Projects Division of the United States War Department had designed programs specifically to facilitate this shift. Beginning in 1944, selected prisoners were exposed to more intensive re-education efforts. They attended lectures on democratic governance. They read books that had been banned in Germany, works by Remarque, Mann, and other German authors whose writing had been deemed subversive. They discussed current events using uncensored American newspapers as source material. Camp Concordia in Kansas, where Hartmann was held, became one of the centers for these programs. A camp newspaper called Der Ruf. The call was published by prisoners under American supervision. The newspaper was carefully calibrated to present democratic ideas, without appearing to be crude propaganda. It asked questions rather than providing answers. It reported facts and allowed readers to draw their own conclusions. And it reached prisoners across the American camp system, creating a network of men who were beginning to understand that alternatives to authoritarianism existed. The Americans also brought in German émigrés who had fled Nazi persecution, intellectuals, academics, and former politicians who could speak to prisoners in their own language and cultural framework. These emigrants did not lecture. They conversed. They asked prisoners about their experiences and provided context that challenged them without hectoring. The goal was not to create American patriots out of German soldiers. It was to create Germans who understood that democracy could work, who would return home committed to preventing another Hitler from rising to power. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Hartmann became increasingly involved in these programs. He attended lectures, he read the forbidden books, he contributed articles to Der Ruf under a pseudonym, writing about his experiences in North Africa and his growing understanding of why Germany had lost. The process was gradual and often painful. Accepting that you had fought for an evil cause, that your comrades had died for lies, that your own government had betrayed you, this required confronting psychological realities that many prisoners simply could not face. But the Willow Run tour had been transformative in a way that lectures and books could not match. It provided physical evidence of the industrial disparity that had doomed Germany. When Hartmann closed his eyes, he could still see that assembly line stretching into the distance, bombers emerging at precise 63-minute intervals, the casual efficiency of workers who had transformed mass production into an art form. The image was indelible, and it changed how he understood everything about the war. In the weeks following the tour, Hartmann found himself thinking not just about Willow Run, but about the broader implications of what he had witnessed. The factory represented more than industrial capacity. It represented a different way of organizing society. In Germany, the state had attempted to mobilize resources through command and control, through ideology and terror. Every aspect of life had been subordinated to the war effort. Children had been indoctrinated, dissenters had been silenced, slave labor had been employed, and yet German production remained a fraction of American output. America had achieved more through voluntary cooperation than Germany had achieved through coercion. American workers at Willow Run earned wages, went home to families, participated in unions, voted in elections, and criticized their government in newspapers that were not censored. And they produced 23 bombers per day. The example suggested that freedom was not weakness but strength, that democratic chaos was more productive than authoritarian order, that societies built on consent were more powerful than societies built on fear. This was the deepest lesson of Willow Run, the one that went beyond production statistics and assembly line efficiency. It suggested that everything Nazi ideology taught about power and organization was wrong, not just tactically wrong, not just strategically wrong, but fundamentally, philosophically wrong at the most basic level. The strong man, the unified will, the racial hierarchy, none of it worked as well as democratic pluralism, individual liberty, and economic freedom. German prisoners were not the only ones undergoing this education. Throughout the American camp system, which held approximately 378,000 German POWs at its peak, Similar transformations were occurring. Most prisoners worked on farms or in factories, earning minimal wages but experiencing American abundance firsthand. They ate better food as prisoners than they had eaten as soldiers. They lived in better conditions. They received better medical care. And everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of a productive capacity that made German industry look pathetic by comparison. The farmers who employed prisoner labor often treated them with a kindness that bewildered men who had been taught that Americans were cruel and ruthless. Margaret Dietrich, wife of a Kansas farmer who employed several prisoners, served them pie during lunch breaks and explained that she hoped someone was feeding her sons who were serving overseas. This simple gesture of reciprocal humanity, this recognition that enemies were also human beings deserving of basic decency, challenged propaganda that had portrayed the conflict in absolute moral terms. Many prisoners formed friendships with Americans, tentative at first, then deepening as trust developed. These friendships were complicated by the fact that the Americans they befriended had sons or brothers or husbands serving in Europe, fighting against Germany. But the complications were precisely the point. War made enemies of people who had no personal animus toward each other, who might in different circumstances have been friends, who shared fundamental human experiences despite belonging to opposed nations. The camp authorities encouraged these interactions when they occurred naturally. The goal was not to make prisoners love America, but to help them understand that alternatives to National Socialism existed, that Germans could build a different kind of society after the war. That defeat might become the foundation for something better. The Americans understood, perhaps better than they articulated explicitly, that peace required not just military victory but psychological transformation. Germany had to be occupied, yes, but more importantly, Germans had to choose not to repeat the mistakes that had led to 2 world wars in a single generation. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was clearly ending. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies were closing on Berlin. The Reich was collapsing in on itself, its industrial base destroyed, its military defeated, its ideology discredited. In American prison camps, German POWs gathered around radios to hear reports of their homeland's final agony. Some wept, some maintained grim silence. A few celebrated quietly, recognizing that Germany's defeat would end a nightmare that had consumed Europe. Hartmann listened to the reports with complex emotions. He had no loyalty remaining to the Nazi regime. The Willow Run tour and the months of reflection that followed had destroyed whatever ideological commitment he once possessed. But Germany was still his home, and the reports of destruction were personal. His family was in Hamburg, a city that had been firestormed by Allied bombers in 1943. He did not know if they had survived. Letters from home had stopped arriving months earlier, and the uncertainty was worse than confirmed bad news. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the news reached camp, Concordia through official channels and then through radio broadcasts. The camp authorities assembled all prisoners in the main yard and informed them formally that the war in Europe had ended, that Germany had capitulated unconditionally, that the Reich was no more. The prisoners received the news in stunned silence. Some had anticipated it for months, others had clung to impossible hopes of last-minute victory. Now there was only the fact of defeat and the uncertain prospect of eventual repatriation. Repatriation proved to be a slow process. American authorities initially intended to return prisoners quickly, but the chaos in Europe delayed implementation. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Infrastructure was destroyed. Food was scarce. The Allies needed labor to clear rubble, repair roads, and rebuild facilities. Many German POWs were kept in American camps or transferred to British and French custody, where they worked for months or years before finally being allowed to return home. Hartmann remained in Kansas until late 1946. He continued working on farms, earning his 80 cents per day, saving the script that could be exchanged for chocolate and cigarettes in the camp canteen. He attended lectures and discussion groups organized by the Special Projects Division. He read extensively history, philosophy, economics, literature. He was, in a sense, receiving the university education that the war had interrupted, though the education came from an unexpected source and in unexpected circumstances. In December of 1946, Hartmann was finally processed for repatriation. He was transported by train to New York, where he boarded a ship for Europe along with several hundred other prisoners. The voyage took 10 days. During the crossing, Hartmann stood on deck and watched the Atlantic swells, thinking about the journey that had brought him to America 2 years earlier. He had arrived defeated and confused, clinging to beliefs that were already crumbling. He would leave with a different understanding, not just of why Germany lost, but of what had been wrong with the Germany that started the war. The ship docked at Le Havre, and the prisoners were transferred to a British processing centre. After several weeks of bureaucratic delays, Hartmann was finally released to return to the British occupation zone of Germany. The journey took him through France, which showed extensive war damage, but was already rebuilding, and then into Germany itself. What he found shocked him despite his preparation. The British zone included Hamburg, his home city, and Hamburg had been destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. The firestorm of July 1943 had killed 42,000 people in a single night and left vast sections of the city as nothing but rubble. Hartmann walked through streets he no longer recognized, past buildings that no longer existed, searching for the apartment block where his family had lived. The building stood, damaged but habitable. His wife answered his knock, and for a moment she simply stared, as if seeing a ghost. Then recognition dawned, and she collapsed against him, weeping. His 2 daughters, now 9 and 11, aged beyond their years by privation and fear, watched from the doorway, wary of this stranger who claimed to be their father. They had survived, barely. His wife had worked in a factory until the bombing became too intense, then in a hospital until medical supplies ran out, then doing whatever work she could find. They had lived on rations that made American prisoner rations look generous. They had survived by selling possessions, by bartering, by accepting help from neighbors when help was available, by enduring when help was not. That night, lying beside his wife in the darkness of their damaged apartment, Hartmann tried to explain where he had been and what he had learned. He told her about Kansas, about the abundance that seemed impossible, about the camp canteen that sold ice cream while German civilians starved. He told her about Willow Run, about watching bombers roll off the assembly line every 63 minutes, about finally understanding why Germany had lost. "Did they treat you well?" she asked, her voice carrying a tone that suggested she expected the answer to be no, that prisoners of war were not treated well, that this was simply the nature of things. "Better than we deserved," Hartmann said. "Better than Germany treating its prisoners. Better, in some ways, than Germany treating its own soldiers. The Americans fed us, housed us, paid us wages for our work. They showed us newspapers without censorship. They took us to factories and showed us exactly why we could not win. They did not do this to humiliate us. They did it because they wanted us to understand, so that when we came home, we would help build something different." His wife was silent for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I hope we can build something different, because what we had before was not worth defending. I did not understand that while the war was happening, I thought we were the victims, that the world was against us, that we fought for survival. But you cannot survive by destroying others. We learned that. It cost us everything. But we learned." The Germany that Hartmann returned to in 1946 bore little resemblance to the nation he had left 4 years earlier. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had lasted 12, ending in complete catastrophic collapse. Berlin was rubble, divided into occupation zones by the victorious powers. The Nazi Party was banned, its leadership dead or awaiting trial at Nuremberg. The economy had collapsed, millions were homeless, food was scarce. The infrastructure of modern life, electricity, water, transportation, functioned sporadically, if at all. But beneath the physical destruction, something more profound was occurring. Germany was confronting the full truth of what the Nazi regime had done. The concentration camps had been liberated, their horror documented in photographs and films that could not be dismissed as propaganda. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology, was being exposed in trials and testimony. Germans who had claimed ignorance of these crimes found themselves unable to maintain that fiction as evidence accumulated. For men like Hartman, who had spent years in American captivity exposed to uncensored information, the revelations were horrifying, but not entirely surprising. The Special Projects Division had shown prisoners films of concentration camp liberations, had provided access to documentation of Nazi atrocities, and had forced confrontation with the regime's true nature. Many prisoners had refused to believe. Others, like Hartman, had accepted the evidence and begun the painful process of understanding what they had fought for. Now, back in Germany, Hartman encountered people at various stages of this same process. Some remained in denial, insisting the camps were fabrications or exaggerations. Others admitted the crimes but claimed they had not known, that they had been deceived by leadership, that ordinary Germans bore no responsibility. A few accepted collective guilt and began the harder work of building a society that would prevent such horrors from recurring. Hartman found work eventually, employed by the British occupation authorities to help rebuild infrastructure. The work was hard, the pay minimal, but it provided purpose and a small income in an economy where currency had lost most of its value. He worked alongside other returned prisoners, many of whom had undergone similar transformations during captivity. They spoke carefully about their experiences, aware that not everyone was ready to hear uncomfortable truths. The Willow Run tour remained vivid in Hartman's memory, a touchstone experience that explained so much about the war's outcome. When fellow workers complained about Allied occupation or expressed nostalgia for German greatness, Hartman would sometimes describe what he had witnessed in Michigan, the assembly line stretching into the distance. The bomber emerges every 63 minutes. The 42,000 workers produced weapons at a rate that made German industry look medieval. Some listeners dismissed his account as exaggeration or propaganda, but others, particularly those who had seen American equipment in combat or had observed Allied supply operations, recognized the truth. They understood that Germany had attempted to fight a war it could never win, that the outcome had been determined not by tactical brilliance or ideological fervor, but by cold industrial mathematics. Werner Koch, the former Luftwaffe officer who had been on the same Willow Run tour, settled in Hamburg and reconnected with Hartman in 1947. Koch had also returned to find his city destroyed and his family barely surviving. He had found work as a teacher, helping to educate a generation of German children who would grow up in the ruins of the Reich. Over beers in a makeshift tavern, one of the few buildings in their neighborhood still intact enough to house a business, Koch and Hartman discussed what they had learned and what it meant for Germany's future. The conversation was the kind that former prisoners often had, processing their experiences years after the fact, trying to extract meaning from catastrophe. "I think about Willow Run often," Koch said. "Not just the production line itself, but what it represented. The Americans did not win because they were morally superior or racially pure or guided by destiny. They won because they had better systems. Industrial systems, economic systems, political systems that allowed people to work voluntarily and productively rather than through coercion and fear." He gestured around the ruined city visible through the tavern's broken windows. "Look at what our systems produced. A destroyed country, millions dead, cities in rubble. And for what? For the delusion that Germans were superior, that we had a right to dominate Europe, that force and will could overcome material reality." Hartman nodded. "The hardest part is accepting that we were complicit, not just Hitler and the party leadership. Us. We fought for this. We believed the lies, or we chose not to question them. Every bomb that fell on Hamburg, every city that burned, we share responsibility for that because we enabled the regime that started the war." "Do you think the new generation will understand?" Koch asked. "The children growing up now, will they learn the real lessons, or will they be fed new myths about German victimhood and betrayal?" "That depends on us," Hartmann replied, "on what we teach them. If we tell the truth about why we lost and what we were fighting for, they might build something better. If we allow comfortable lies to take hold again, we're doomed to repeat the cycle." This conversation captured a tension that would shape West Germany for decades. The nation faced a choice: confront the full truth of the Nazi era and accept responsibility for its crimes, or retreat into denial and victimhood. The choice was not made once, but continuously, in schools and homes and public discourse, as Germans struggled to understand their recent past and build a different future. The occupation authorities, particularly the Americans, pushed for confrontation with truth. Denazification programs, though implemented unevenly and abandoned somewhat prematurely, aimed to remove Nazi influence from positions of authority. War crimes trials, most famously at Nuremberg, established legal accountability for the regime's actions. Educational reforms sought to teach democratic values and critical thinking, rather than the authoritarian obedience that had enabled Hitler's rise. The Marshall Plan, announced in June of 1947, provided economic aid that accelerated Germany's recovery. The aid was not merely charitable. American planners understood that a prosperous, democratic Germany was essential to European stability and would serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The assistance was also psychologically significant. It demonstrated that the Americans were more interested in rebuilding former enemies than in punishing them, and that the goal was reconciliation rather than revenge. Hartmann witnessed this transformation firsthand. He saw ruined cities begin to rebuild. He saw factories restart production. He saw a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, introduced in 1948, ending the black market chaos that had dominated the economy. He saw political parties form and compete in free elections, something Germany had not experienced since before Hitler's rise to power. The transformation was not smooth or complete, but it was real. By the early 1950s, West Germany was experiencing what became known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. The economy grew at rates that astonished observers. Living standards rose rapidly. The physical scars of war were gradually erased as new buildings replaced bombed ruins. Germany, at least the western part of it, was becoming prosperous and democratic, integrated into European and Atlantic institutions that would prevent another war. But economic recovery did not automatically resolve the deeper questions about Germany's past and future. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, tensions persisted between those who wanted to confront Nazi crimes honestly and those who preferred to move on without dwelling on uncomfortable truths. Many Germans maintained that they had simply followed orders, that they had not known about the concentration camps, that they bore no personal responsibility for atrocities committed by the regime. Hartmann, like others, returned. Prisoners who had undergone re-education in American camps found this attitude frustrating and dangerous. He knew that confronting the truth was painful but necessary. He knew that Germany could not build a healthy democracy on a foundation of denial and evasion. He became involved in local efforts to teach younger generations about the war, serving as a guest speaker in schools and community organizations. When he spoke to students, Hartmann often focused not on battles or military history, but on his experience at Willow Run. He described the assembly line, the precision manufacturing, the overwhelming productive capacity that had made German defeat inevitable. He explained that modern wars between industrial nations were won by economic systems and industrial capacity, not by ideology or willpower. And he used this concrete example to make a broader point, that Germany had been defeated not because of betrayal or bad luck, but because the Nazi system was fundamentally ineffective, that authoritarian control could not compete with democratic pluralism when it came to mobilizing resources and motivating people. The students often asked whether he felt bitter about his years as a prisoner, about fighting for a cause that was both evil and doomed. Hartmann's answer evolved over time but retained essential consistency. "I feel grateful," he would say. "Grateful that I was captured by Americans and not Soviets. Grateful that I spent the war in Kansas rather than Siberia. Grateful that I was given the chance to learn why we lost and what we had been fighting for. Not everyone got that chance. Many of my comrades died believing the lies. I lived to understand the truth, and that understanding helped me build a better life in a better Germany. This attitude was not universal among returned prisoners. Some remained bitter about defeat and captivity. Some clung to Nazi ideology despite everything. But a significant number had undergone transformations similar to Hartmann's, and their influence on post-war German society was substantial. They became teachers, businessmen, civil servants, ordinary citizens who had learned hard lessons about the dangers of authoritarianism and the importance of democratic institutions. The children who had asked Klaus Hartmann questions in the 1950s grew up to be the generation that would further transform Germany. By the 1960s and 70s, young Germans were demanding more honest confrontation with the Nazi past, challenging their parents' generation to acknowledge complicity rather than claiming universal innocence. This generational reckoning was painful but ultimately healthy, forcing German society to accept responsibility and commit to ensuring that such horrors would never recur. Hartmann lived to see this transformation. He retired in 1978 after decades of work in construction and engineering, having helped rebuild the physical infrastructure of Hamburg. He remained active in community organizations, particularly those focused on Holocaust education and reconciliation. He maintained correspondence with several American veterans, including one of the guards from Camp Concordia, who had become a friend during the war. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, Hartmann was invited to return to the United States as part of a Veterans Reconciliation Program. He flew to Michigan, his first flight since capture in 1943, and visited Willow Run. The facility had been converted to civilian use after the war, producing automobiles and other goods. The assembly line that had produced B-24s no longer existed in its original form, though the building itself remained. Standing in that space again, elderly and grey, Hartmann felt the same awe he had experienced as a young prisoner 40 years earlier. He explained to his American hosts what the tour had meant to him, how it had shattered his beliefs and forced him to confront truths he had been avoiding. "This building," he said, "taught me more about why Germany lost than any history book. Not because it humiliated me, but because it showed me what America could accomplish when it applied its resources systematically and intelligently. You defeated us with organization and productivity, not with cruelty or vengeance." That lesson stayed with me for life. The Americans who heard him seemed moved by his testimony. Some were veterans who had fought in Europe, who had witnessed the destruction of German cities and wondered whether such devastation had been necessary. Hartmann's acknowledgement that defeat had been not just inevitable but perhaps ultimately beneficial for Germany helped ease guilt. They still carried about their role in that destruction. Hartmann also met with Ford Motor Company executives and historians who were documenting Willow Run's history. They were surprised by how vividly he remembered details of the facility, the assembly line's length, the 63-minute production cycle, the employment figures. His testimony became part of the historical record, preserved in archives for future researchers studying the industrial history of the Second World War. Before returning to Germany, Hartmann spent time in Kansas, visiting the site of Camp Concordia, which had been dismantled after the war. He walked the fields where he had once harvested sugar beets as a prisoner, remembering the farmer who had employed him and his wife who had served pie to enemy prisoners. He learned that both had passed away, but their son, who had returned from the Pacific War and inherited the farm, still remembered the German POWs who had worked there. The son, now elderly himself, invited Hartmann to dinner. They spoke about the war, about what it had meant to both their lives, about the strange experience of enemies becoming something like friends. The son explained that his father had told him about showing prisoners, American newspapers, and discussing the war's progress, trying to help them understand that Germany could not win. He said that if you boys understood what you were up against, you might go home and prevent it from happening again, the son recalled. Looks like it worked. Hartmann returned to Hamburg carrying these memories. He had lived long enough to see Germany reunified after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, long enough to see his country become a prosperous democracy, a leader in European integration, a nation that had learned from its catastrophic mistakes and built something genuinely better from the ruins. He died in 1994, just months before the 50th anniversary of his tour of Willow Run. His obituary in the local Hamburg newspaper mentioned his military service briefly, but focused more on his post-war work in education and reconciliation. The obituary noted that he had been a prisoner of war in the United States, and that the experience had shaped his commitment to democracy and his opposition to any revival of authoritarian politics. His widow donated his papers to a university archive studying the POW experience. Among the materials was the folder Robert Mitchell had given him in March of 1945, containing production statistics and photographs of Willow Run. The folder had survived decades, its pages yellowed but still legible, a tangible artifact of the moment when one man's certainty had collided with overwhelming evidence. Historians who later reviewed these materials recognized their significance. The Willow Run tours, along with similar programs exposing prisoners to American industrial capacity, represented a form of psychological warfare that was both more subtle and more effective than traditional propaganda. By simply showing prisoners the truth, by letting them witness American productive capacity firsthand, the programs undermined Nazi ideology more effectively than any amount of argument could have accomplished. The success of these programs informed post-war occupation policy. The Americans understood that defeating Germany militarily was necessary but insufficient. Defeating the ideology that had made Nazism possible required changing how Germans thought about power, authority, and national greatness. The POW re-education programs were an early experiment in this broader effort, and their relative success suggested that confrontation with truth could facilitate transformation. The legacy of Willow Run itself extended far beyond its wartime production. The facility demonstrated that mass production principles could be applied to extraordinarily complex products, that standardization and precision manufacturing could coexist. That enormous scale did not necessarily mean inferior quality. These lessons influenced post-war American industry and, eventually, manufacturing worldwide. The facility also represented something more abstract but equally important: the superiority of free systems over authoritarian ones. The workers at Willow Run were not slaves or conscripts. They were free citizens working for wages in a democratic society. They could quit. They could strike. They could criticize their government. And yet they produced weapons at rates that totalitarian Germany, with its command economy and forced labor, could never match. This paradox was not lost on the German prisoners who witnessed Willow Run's operations. They had been taught that only authoritarian discipline could achieve great industrial feats, that democratic chaos and individual liberty inevitably led to weakness. The evidence before their eyes contradicted everything they had been taught. The contradiction forced them to question not just tactical decisions or strategic planning, but the fundamental assumptions about power and organization that underlay Nazi ideology. Some prisoners never resolved this contradiction. They returned to Germany still believing in authoritarian principles, still convinced that Germany had lost through betrayal or bad luck, rather than through systemic weakness. But many others, like Klaus Hartmann, underwent genuine transformations. They recognized that they had been lied to, that the ideology they had fought for was not only evil but also ineffective, that free societies were stronger and more productive than authoritarian ones. These transformed prisoners became part of the foundation of post-war German democracy. They were not numerous enough to determine outcomes alone. Germany's transformation required much larger forces, including occupation policies, economic aid, and the efforts of millions of Germans who had never been prisoners. But the returned POWs who had experienced American re-education programs provided important testimony. They could speak from personal experience about American society, about industrial capacity, about the superiority of democratic systems. Their voices carried authority that Allied propaganda could never match. The story of Klaus Hartmann and his fellow prisoners at Willow Run thus represents a small but significant chapter in the larger story of how Germany was transformed from a totalitarian aggressor into a democratic partner. It was a transformation achieved not through punishment or revenge, but through a combination of material aid, patient education, and above all, exposure to truth. The truth was that Germany had started a war it could never win, fought for an ideology that was both morally abhorrent and practically ineffective, and lost because its systems could not compete with those of its enemies. This truth was difficult for Germans to accept. It contradicted decades of propaganda and national mythology. It required acknowledging collective responsibility for enormous crimes. It meant accepting that German superiority, racial or otherwise, was a lie. But accepting this truth was also liberating. It created space for building something new, for embracing democracy not as a weakness, but as a strength, for understanding that national greatness came not from domination, but from cooperation and mutual respect. The assembly line at Willow Run, producing bombers every 63 minutes, became a symbol of this truth. It represented the power of free people working within effective systems. It demonstrated that quality and quantity were not opposites, but could be achieved simultaneously through intelligent organization. It showed that modern war was won by industrial capacity, not by ideology or willpower. And it helped convince at least some German soldiers that they had fought for the wrong side, that defeat was not a tragedy but an opportunity, that truth was more valuable than comfortable lies. Klaus Hartmann understood this. He spent his life after Willow Run trying to share that understanding with others, to help build a Germany that would never repeat the mistakes of the Nazi era. He succeeded, at least partially. The Germany he helped build was prosperous, democratic, and peaceful, a far better nation than the one he had fought for as a young soldier. When historians in future decades studied the re-education of German prisoners of war, they consistently identified the Willow Run tours as among the most effective programs. The impact was not universal, some prisoners remained unmoved. But for those who were psychologically ready to question their beliefs, the experience of witnessing American industrial capacity firsthand was transformative. It provided concrete evidence that could not be dismissed as propaganda, that forced confrontation with mathematical realities that made defeat comprehensible. The bombers that rolled off Willow Run's assembly line every 63 minutes had not just defeated Germany militarily, they had defeated the ideology that made Nazi aggression possible. They had demonstrated that free people, working voluntarily within effective systems, could outproduce and ultimately defeat authoritarian regimes that relied on coercion and lies. This lesson, learned by prisoners like Klaus Hartmann in the spring of 1945, helped shape the post-war world and contributed to the eventual triumph of democratic values over totalitarian alternatives. The physical evidence of that triumph is visible today in the reunified, prosperous, democratic Germany that has emerged from the ruins of the Third Reich. The psychological evidence is harder to measure, but no less real. It exists in the testimonies of men like Hartmann, who witnessed American industrial might and understood its implications, who returned home determined to build something better, who spent decades working to ensure that the horrors of the Nazi era would never be repeated. Willow Run's assembly line is silent now, converted to other uses, its wartime purpose a matter of historical record. But its impact continues. It helped win a war. It helped transform enemies into partners. And it provided concrete demonstration of a truth that remains relevant, that free societies, for all their apparent chaos and inefficiency, can mobilize resources and achieve results that authoritarian systems cannot match. This truth, learned by German prisoners standing on an observation deck in Michigan, watching bombers emerge at precise intervals, remains one of the most important lessons of the Second World War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.